My son looked me dead in the eye at his own Thanksgiving table, in front of his wife's entire family, and said, "Dad, let's be honest. You've never really made anything of yourself." Then he laughed, and his father-in-law laughed with him, and his wife topped off her wineglass like nothing had happened. I sat very still. I put my fork down on the edge of my plate, very carefully, and I smiled. I didn't say a word. What I was doing, in that moment, was not swallowing my pride. I was making a list. Before I tell you what was on that list, I want you to understand something about me. My name is Walter Briggs. I am 63 years old. I live alone in a house that doesn't look like much from the outside. White siding, a metal roof, a front porch with 2 rocking chairs that need repainting. I drive a 2009 Ford F-150 with a dent above the rear left wheel well that I keep telling myself I'll fix. I wear Carhartt on weekdays and a plain blue button-down on Sundays. People see me coming and they make assumptions, and I have spent the last 20 years letting them. I was a carpenter for 31 years. I started when I was 19, working for a man named Harlan Pruitt in Knoxville, Tennessee, hauling lumber and sweeping sawdust for $8 an hour. By the time I was 26, I had my own contractor's license. By 32, I was the one hiring. By 45, I had built and sold 11 residential properties in the Knoxville metro area and used the proceeds to buy a strip mall on Highway 11W that I still own today. The strip mall has 14 units. 13 are leased. The 14th I keep empty because it's on the corner and I like having options. I also own a self-storage facility outside Maryville, a small apartment complex in Oak Ridge, and a 40% stake in a commercial building in downtown Knoxville that my accountant keeps telling me to sell and that I keep refusing to sell because the coffee shop on the ground floor makes the best cup of dark roast I've ever had in my life. My net worth, as of my last sit-down with my financial advisor, is just under $4 million. My son has never asked me directly, and I have never volunteered the number. I believe people behave better when they don't know what you're worth. I believed that for a long time. My son, Derek, is 38. He has my jaw and his mother's stubbornness, and a lifestyle he absolutely cannot afford without my help. His mother passed 8 years ago, breast cancer. Too fast. The way those things always seem to be too fast. After she was gone, I tried to step in. I paid off the remaining balance on Derek's student loans, $61,000, because I didn't want grief to become debt. When he and his wife bought their house in Farragut, I gave them the down payment $40,000 as a gift, though he called it a loan, the way people do when they want to feel better about taking. When his landscaping business hit a dry spell 2 winters ago, I transferred $22,000 into his business account without being asked, because his wife had just told them they were expecting, and I did not want my grandchild born into a crisis. The pregnancy ended in a miscarriage 6 weeks later, which broke all of our hearts, and I never once mentioned the money or asked for it back. I tell you all of this not to make myself sound generous. I tell you because you need to understand what was sitting quietly under the table on Thanksgiving. It had been my son's idea to host. He called me in October, voice full of that particular enthusiasm he gets when he's trying to impress someone, and told me his wife's parents were coming down from Cincinnati, and wouldn't it be nice if we all did Thanksgiving together, one big family? I said yes. I drove 2 hours from Knoxville to Farragut on a Wednesday evening, stopping to pick up a pecan pie from a bakery in Lenoir City because my daughter-in-law had once mentioned she liked it. I brought a bottle of bourbon I had been saving, a 15-year small batch from a distillery in Bardstown, Kentucky, the kind that runs about $90. I ironed my blue button-down. My son's in-laws arrived on Thursday morning in a rented Escalade. My daughter-in-law's father, Richard, was a loud man with a loud watch and an even louder way of taking up space in a room. He worked in wealth management in Cincinnati. He told me 3 separate times. He had already started talking about his firm before he'd taken off his coat. His wife was pleasant enough, quiet, the kind of woman who has learned over the years how to exist at low volume around a high-volume husband. My daughter-in-law lit up when they walked in the door, the way she always does around her parents, like she becomes a slightly more confident, slightly more reckless version of herself. Dinner was set for 2 o'clock. The table was beautiful. I'll give them that they had done it right. Linen cloth, real candles, the good dishes. I sat at the far end. Richard sat at the other end, like he owned the chair. My son sat in the middle, next to his wife, in that specific posture he has when he's performing for people he's trying to impress, back straight, gestures wide, the voice about 15% louder than it needs to be. The conversation moved the way those conversations do: football, travel, real estate. Richard mentioned a vacation home he'd recently bought in the Outer Banks. My son leaned forward and asked questions the way a student leans toward a professor. I ate my turkey. I asked my daughter-in-law to pass the cranberry sauce. I said something about the sweet potatoes being excellent, which they were. It was during a lull, one of those quiet moments right after the second round of wine, that Richard looked down the table at me and said, in that tone that pretends to be friendly while doing something else entirely, "So Walter, what is it you do? Retired? More or less?" I said. "He was a carpenter," my son said. And the way he said it, not proudly, not neutrally, but with a very small, very deliberate flattening of the word, like it was something he was setting aside, told me everything. He continued, "He built houses, custom homes. It's good work." The last sentence was an afterthought, the kind of afterthought that is worse than silence. Richard nodded. "Good, honest work," he said. The way people say that phrase when they are doing the opposite of complimenting you. My son laughed a little. I watched him glance at his wife, then back at Richard, and something in that triangular look told me what was coming, the way you sometimes know a weather change before the clouds arrive. "I'll say this, Dad," he said, and he smiled my son's smile that I have loved since he was 7 years old, now aimed at me like something else. Richard has been a real mentor to me this year, business-wise. He thinks differently. He's built something, you know? Something that actually scales. He paused. No offense, but swinging a hammer, it has a ceiling. Richard has shown me what it looks like when you think bigger. The table was quiet. "No offense," he said again, the way people repeat it when they know it landed. I looked at my son for a moment. I thought about the $61,000. I thought about the $40,000 for the house that we both agreed to call a loan. I thought about the $22,000 that went into his business account on a cold February morning when I was still grieving my daughter-in-law's miscarriage alongside them. I thought about the fact that the house they were sitting in, the one with the beautiful linen tablecloth and the real candles and the good dishes, had a mortgage that I had been quietly supplementing every single month for 14 months because his landscaping revenue had not recovered the way he'd told me it would. I picked up my fork. "Pass the rolls?" I said. Richard laughed. My son laughed. My daughter-in-law smiled into her wine. The moment passed. I stayed through dessert. I ate 2 pieces of the pecan pie. I washed my plate in the kitchen because that's how I was raised. I said goodbye to Richard and his wife, and I told them it was genuinely nice to meet them, because it was. I hugged my daughter-in-law. I hugged my son. And when I hugged him, I held it 1 second longer than usual, the way you do when something is ending and you already know it. I drove home to Knoxville. I put the leftover bourbon in the cabinet, still mostly full. I sat in my kitchen for a long time with a glass of water, and I thought about my father, who was also a carpenter, and who told me once that the quietest man in the room has usually already made his decision. I had made mine. The next morning, I called my attorney. His name is Gary Sutherland, and he's been with me for 19 years, and he does not ask unnecessary questions. I told him I needed to review 3 things: the promissory note on the $40,000 down payment loan, the co-signer structure on Derek's business line of credit, and the paperwork on the Oak Ridge apartment complex, specifically the unit my son had been renting at a significant discount for the first 2 years of his marriage before he bought the Farragut house. Gary said he'd have everything on his desk by Tuesday. Monday, I called the bank. My son's landscaping business, Briggs Outdoor Services, carried a line of credit on which I was listed as a guarantor. The credit limit was $35,000. The current balance drawn was $28,000. As guarantor, I had the right to notify the bank of my intent to withdraw the guarantee at the end of the current term, which was 90 days out. I gave that notice. The woman on the phone was professional and thorough and asked me to confirm in writing, which I did before I hung up. I want to be clear about something. I did not do this in anger. Anger is loud and imprecise, and it damages things you didn't intend to damage. What I felt, sitting in my kitchen in the days after Thanksgiving, was not anger. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you've been looking at something slightly blurred for a long time and finally you put on your glasses. My son was 38 years old. He had a wife, a business, a mortgage, a truck, and a life that he had arranged around the assumption of my continued and invisible support. He had looked at me across a Thanksgiving table in front of strangers and told me, in the nicest possible way, that I was a ceiling he had learned to see past. He had used a word scales that I knew he got from Richard, not from any experience of his own. My son had never in his adult life built a thing he didn't need my money to get started, and he had done it with the specific confidence of someone who has never had to think about where the floor is. I decided to let him find the floor. The mortgage supplement was the simplest. I had been making direct transfers to their joint checking account, $1,400 a month, labeled family. I set a stop on the next transfer. I sent my son a text that evening, not angry, not explanatory, just factual. Transfer paused this month. Let's talk when you have time. He responded 2 days later with a thumbs-up emoji, which told me he hadn't noticed yet or didn't want to ask. He noticed by the second week of December. He called on a Tuesday evening, around 7. His voice had that careful, low-pressure quality he uses when he wants something and is trying not to sound like he does. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine, that I'd been finishing a deck project for a neighbor. He said that sounded nice. Then, very casually, he mentioned that things had been a little tight with the business in the fourth quarter, and he wanted to make sure the family transfers were still coming through. I paused those. I said, "Silence." "Why?" he said. "I've been doing some thinking," I said, "about the structure of things." "What does that mean?" "It means I've been thinking," I said. "How's the business line looking?" Another pause. Longer. "That's actually something I wanted to talk to you about. I may need to draw a little more before the end of Q4. You should know," I said, "that I've given notice to the bank about my guarantee. It's a 90-day process. It won't affect you immediately." The silence this time was different. I could hear him breathing. "Dad," he said, and the quality of the word changed completely. The performance left it. He just said "Dad" the way he used to when he was a kid, and something had gone wrong. "What's going on?" "Nothing's going on," I said. "I love you, but I've been carrying weight that I don't think has been good for either of us. I want you to build something that's yours, something that actually scales." I said that last part quietly. Not cruelly, just so he'd hear it. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was tight. "Is this about Thanksgiving?" "Thanksgiving was a nice dinner," I said. "Good sweet potatoes." "Dad, get some rest," I said. "We'll talk in the new year." I said goodbye and I sat with the phone face down on the kitchen table for a while. I thought about the 7-year-old version of my son who used to come to job sites with me on Saturdays, who wore a tiny tool belt I'd bought him at the hardware store, who once told a foreman very seriously that his dad could build anything. I thought about that little boy and I grieved him a little, the way you grieve the distance between who a person was and who they've become. And then I put the phone on the charger and I went to bed. My daughter-in-law called on a Thursday morning in the second week of December, which surprised me, because she has never been the one to call. Her voice was polished the way a stone is polished when you're working very hard to control its edges. She told me she hoped I was well. She told me the holidays were coming up and she was hoping we could all get together. She told me that Derek had mentioned some confusion about the bank situation, and she just wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings. "There's no misunderstanding," I said pleasantly. She pivoted. She mentioned that they had some expenses coming. The furnace had needed servicing. The business insurance was renewing. December was always a slower month for landscaping. She asked, very delicately, whether I might be able to help bridge the gap. "I gave Derek a loan some years ago," I said. "I believe the principal was $40,000. I'd like to revisit that paperwork in January." A pause. "Walter," she said, and now the polish was gone. "We have a life here. We have a mortgage. Derek's business is Derek's? I said. Which is how it should be. He's a capable man. I raised him to be capable. She said my name again. I heard in her voice the specific register of someone who has always relied on a thing and is only now understanding it might not be there. Tell Derek I love him, I said. Merry Christmas. Christmas came. I spent it with my sister and her family in Maryville. Good food. The right kind of noise. The kind of noise that fills a room without taking anything from you. My nephew showed me a woodworking project he'd started. I gave him advice about grain direction. I felt, sitting at my sister's table, the particular lightness that comes when you realize a weight you've been carrying was optional. My son called on the 27th. He did not bother with the careful opening this time. His voice was direct in the way it gets when he's been sitting with something long enough that the performance has exhausted him and he's down to the truth. He asked me to talk to him seriously. I told him I was listening. He asked me why I was doing this. I told him I wasn't doing anything, I was stopping doing something, which is different. He was quiet. Dad, he said, I know Thanksgiving was. I know some things were said that. I don't need an apology about Thanksgiving, I said. I need you to understand something. For years, I have been a foundation you didn't know you were standing on. And because you didn't know, you started to believe the floor was something you built yourself. I understand that. It's a natural thing. But it was a mistake I let happen, and I'm correcting it. Not to punish you. To tell you the truth. He didn't say anything. You told me, in front of people, that I hadn't built anything worth admiring. I said. I didn't argue with you then, but I'm telling you now that you have been living in a house I built, in more ways than one. I need you to go build your own. The silence stretched out long enough that I counted the seconds 12, 13, 14. How bad is it? He finally asked. He meant the money, the line of credit, the transfers, what was coming. Manageable, I said. If you manage it. I told him I was not going to let them lose the house. I would convert the down payment loan to a formal mortgage at fair interest and give him a restructured payment timeline. I told him the business line had 90 days before the guarantee lapsed, which was enough time to seek alternative financing if he worked at it. I told him that I would always be his father and I would always answer the phone, but that I was done being the floor he didn't know he was standing on. I need you to stand, I said. I need you to know you're standing. He cried. Not loudly. My son has never cried loudly. Not even as a kid, but I heard it in the tight pauses between his words when he said he was sorry. He said he hadn't meant it the way it came out. He said he'd been showing off for Richard, and he'd been doing it for months, and he knew, somewhere, that it wasn't honest. He said he didn't actually believe the things he'd said. He said he was scared. I know, I said. That's the right thing to feel right now. I told him I loved him. I told him we would figure out the details in January. I told him to go be with his wife and stop carrying this alone tonight. After I hung up, I poured 2 fingers of the Bardstown bourbon, the bottle I'd brought to Thanksgiving, the one that came home with me still mostly full, and I sat on my front porch in a wool jacket in the December cold, and I watched the neighbors' Christmas lights blink in the dark, and I thought about my father again. He died when I was 41, which means he never saw the strip mall, or the storage facility, or the apartment complex, or any of the quiet accumulation that came after. What he saw was me at 30-something, still swinging a hammer, still dirt under my fingernails, still driving a truck with a dent in it, and he was prouder of me than I ever fully understood at the time. He used to say, and this is the truest thing anyone has ever said to me, he used to say that the man who knows exactly what he's worth never needs anyone else to tell him. I am 63 years old. I have $4 million, give or take, and a truck with a dent I keep meaning to fix, and a porch with 2 rocking chairs that need repainting, and a son who is, I believe, finally going to learn something real. I spent a lot of years being invisible. I spent a lot of years letting people mistake the quiet for the empty, the simple for the small. Richard called me in January, actually. I don't know what my daughter-in-law told him, or what version of events made its way up to Cincinnati, but he called me on a Tuesday, and his voice was considerably less enormous than it had been at Thanksgiving. He was pleasant. He was respectful, in the way a man is respectful when he has received new information. He mentioned that he understood I had some holdings in commercial real estate in the Knoxville area. He said he'd love to connect sometime. Pick my brain. He mentioned his firm worked with real estate investors. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I was pretty well set. My son and I had lunch in February, just the two of us, at a diner in Farragut that we used to go to when he was in middle school. He ate a Reuben. I had the grilled cheese, which is the best item on the menu and the one my son has never ordered because he thinks it's unsophisticated. We talked for almost 2 hours. He told me about the new contract he'd landed, a commercial property maintenance agreement with a small business park in West Knoxville. Good recurring work, the kind that steadies a business. He'd gotten it himself. He hadn't asked me for an introduction, or a reference, or a bridge loan. He'd made calls and built a proposal and won it on his own merit. And the specific pride in his voice when he described it was different from any pride I'd heard from him in years. It was real. It was not performed. He asked me, toward the end of lunch, why I'd never told him. About the money. About the scope of things. I thought about how to answer that for a moment. I stirred my coffee. Because I wanted you to see me as your father, I said, not as a number. And because I thought mistakenly, I think that doing it quietly was the same as doing it right. He nodded slowly. You're not a loser, Dad, he said. And he looked at the table when he said it, not at me, the way he used to look away when he was embarrassed as a teenager. I know, I said. We split the check. My son grabbed it first, just barely. But he grabbed it and he put his card down, and I let him, and we didn't make a thing of it. Outside in the parking lot, he hugged me the same way I'd hugged him at Thanksgiving, 1 second longer than usual. But this time, I think we both knew what that extra second meant. I drove home to Knoxville on a gray February afternoon with the heat on low and the radio playing something I didn't recognize. The dent above my rear wheel well caught a flash of winter sun as I pulled onto the highway. I made a note to get it looked at. Maybe this spring. Maybe I'd take care of it this spring.